Welcome to our concluding lecture in World Religions. I want to follow up on the beginning and the ending, the origins of Islam according to critical theories, and the various evolution of Islam into other religions and sects that can't exactly be called simply Muslim anymore. But back to the beginning, I'd like to summarize the revisionist view of Islam presented by Patricia Crone and Michael Cook in a great book published some 31 years ago now by Cambridge University Press, a book called Hagarism, The Making of the Islamic World. I found this very fascinating. Chaim Maccabee drew my attention to this. He sent me a copy of a review he had done of it, and I was just really captivated, and years later managed to get the book. It's not easy to find because the authors are not letting Cambridge reprint it. One of them says, I believe Michael Cook says, because he doesn't want to offend and hurt the feelings of some of his Muslim students. I have a hunch what he means is he doesn't want to hurt their feelings to the point where they're going to hurt him physically, I'm sorry to say. But at any rate, they begin with the observation that Islamic sources offer us a sanitized party line account of Islamic origins, as you might expect, an account designed to provide a pedigree for a subsequent orthodoxy. Hence, the tracks have been covered, right? It's all derivative, it's all deductive. You're trying to reason back from the state of affairs you want to justify by showing that, oh yes, it was the inevitable and righteous development. Well, Judaism and Christianity did the same thing. They all do that. If we want to get a critical look at Islamic origins, what we need to do is to start with the evidence of any contemporary non-Muslim reports, records of debates that the early Muslims had with Christians and Jews, and any kind of chronicles stemming from that period to see what light these sources might show on about Islam. Do they show the same picture? I mean, you'd expect less of it, obviously, and less detail, but suppose they show a different one, just to bracket the official version. This is a very new thing to do because until very recently all Western scholars of Islam simply accepted Muslim apologetics, whatever they said about the Quran and Muhammad. Oh yeah, they believed it. Even today, when detractors of Islam and Muhammad criticize them, they tend to take embarrassing traditions and stories that came from official Muslim sources. Of course, not so embarrassing to those who compile them, but embarrassing today. But even that's the same mistake. You're taking way too much of it. Literally, in this history, it's like when some critics of Christianity have said, well, this Jesus character wasn't so great. I mean, after all, look at the cursing of the fig tree. He must have been a really an impatient creep. What do you think? And that's history. Anyway, same problem. Okay, if once you do put together the data as Crone and Cook do, it seems that Muhammad first appeared as the prophetic herald, a kind of a John the Baptist front man or advance man of Umar, a Messiah. Umar, which means speaker. Umar, we know as the Caliph after Abu Bakr in the traditional account, but here he's really the first guy, and he is a Messiah. One big hint of that is that even in his normative Islamic history, he's called Umar al-Faruq, that is the Redeemer. You don't get that as an epithet very lightly. Well, two contemporary Jewish apocalypses mention this. Muhammad is the herald of Umar, the Messiah. Umar, take your pick. Umar, Omar, same, different versions of the same thing. Now, Jewish apocalypses proclaim this Arabic fellow as the Jewish Messiah. Well, yeah. Some Jews were happy to do that, since here was a powerful group that appealed to them and enlisted them in a plan to take over Palestine to liberate it from the Byzantine or Roman, or as they thought of it, Edomite occupiers of Palestine. And they figure, well, he's an Arab, but what the heck? It's not like Jews hadn't heard of that idea before. I'll get to that in a moment. They identified them with Kenites, who had been historic allies of David and Moses and so on. And they figured that Umar, the Messiah, would shortly drive out the Romans. And according to Cook and Crone, this worked. They did gather their forces and went to Palestine and did liberate it from the Byzantine Empire. This was already at the time of Muhammad and Umar, not later, and we'll see why that got changed. Now, where do they get the term Muslim? Well, it first appears on the Dome of the Rock in 691, it's the Common Era, and we don't see the word anywhere else until the late 8th century. Earlier sources call these people the Magaritai, Magaritai. It's a Greek term, and it comes from Greek Papyrus 642. Or, as the Syriac Papyrus 640s calls them, the Mahgre, M-A-H-G-R-E, or Mahgraya, M-A-H-G-R-A-Y-E. All of these would come from the Arabic Muhajirun, those who have gone on the Hijra. What is that? Well, they were known as Hagarenes. You can translate it without the personalizing prefix, which we don't really need in English, because they were engaged in Hijra or Hijra, an exodus like that of Moses from Arabia to Palestine. It was the Promised Land, and the Messiah had to manifest himself there. Now, wait a minute, doesn't Hijra or Hijra have a different meaning? In historic Islam, doesn't that refer to the flight, which is what it literally means, of Muhammad the prophet from Mecca when they were after him and he left and then went up to Medina where he'd been offered power and accepted it? Well, yeah, but their point is that's not what it denoted originally. The flight meant the great exodus, the great transfer of people from Arabia into Palestine, a flight in terms of like a blitzkrieg almost, a great journey. And that this was based on, modeled on, Moses leading the people out of Egypt and taking them to the edge of the Promised Land, where then Joshua led them in conquest. This was happening again, they figured. So they were, and these people, these Arabs and Jews, were organized according to the 12 tribes of the Ishmaelites. If you remember from Genesis, the Ishmaelites had 12 tribes, just like the Israelites did. Well, these people figured that the land belonged to Abraham and his seed. Doesn't the Bible say that? And naturally, that means Ishmael as well as Isaac. So an alliance of Jews and Arabs in a messianic conquest seemed natural to them. And remember, it's Jewish sources that tell us about this. Well, even from the Jewish point of view, all this seemed natural, since Kenites in the Bible were understood to be Arabs. Now, I doubt that's what the original identity was, but that doesn't matter. That's what they were thinking at this period of history. And even a Kenite Messiah occurs in the Jewish work, The Secrets of Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai. The venerated work, and they understand the Messiah to be a Kenite. What was their stance on Jesus? Because that becomes, as we saw last time, a big thing in Islam as we know it. Well, they read these people, these Hagarenes, and remember, Hagar didn't have anything to do with the wife of Abraham the patriarch. Rather, it comes from the people who went on the Hijra or Hijra, right? At any rate, what did the Hagarenes think of Jesus? Well, they rejected Jesus as a false Messiah. Of course, now I'm making it sound like they were contemporaries. No, right? This is still way back there in the time of Islamic origins. 7th century CE. But of course, you had to have an opinion about Jesus because of Christianity, right? So the Hagarenes rejected the Christian Jesus as a false Messiah, and they scorned the cross. The whole idea of a crucified man as the Messiah, get out of here. But their own messianism appears to have been more Samaritan or Mosaic in orientation. I mean, obviously, they're not going to think of Jesus as the Messiah. If these are if this is a Jewish-based movement, thinking that Umar is the Messiah, what else are they going to think of Jesus, this figure of the past, except that he was a false Messiah, an abortive fake? So they don't believe in him, but they move away from a Davidic type Jewish messianism, which would have said a Messiah, an anointed king from David's line, will reestablish Jewish independence. Now, apparently, some of their Jewish allies expected that. They thought that once the Hagarenes conquered Palestine, they would rebuild the temple. And what they did was to raise up the Dome of the Rock on the same site. Now, had Umar built the temple, that would have implied the whole machinery of King David, but they didn't do that. The mosque was a prayer house and so forth. They're a very different thing, and so they began to distance themselves from rabbinic Judaism and to take on the character of Samaritans, in that they, of course, Samaritans, sort of a parallel evolution off the same stock. They evolved a Judaism of their own, and they didn't believe in a Davidic Messiah at all, because Samaria had originated from a schism with Judah in the south. Samaritans wanted nothing to do with the dynasty of David, and so the last thing they would expect or hope for was a Davidic king. Oh, the heck with that. They set their hopes on the prophet like Moses that would one day appear, according to Deuteronomy. And so that's how and he would be like Moses, and later on, some hundreds of years, probably by this time, though, Samaritans had begun to actually expect a second coming of Moses. Well, Umar started to be interpreted in that direction. Now, that was very easy to do, even given the whole Kenite thing, because remember, Moses was married into the family of the Kenite Jethro, the priest of Yahweh and all that. So even that fit. So they went away from the Davidic covenant to the Mosaic one as interpreted by the Samaritans. So they had a kind of Mosaic, non-Davidic Judaism of a sort. They rejected, like the Samaritans, they rejected any biblical books outside the Pentateuch. There was a big thing with the Sadducees and the Samaritans in Judaism. Well, what do you know? The Hagarenes believed only in the Pentateuch, and they probably got that from the Samaritans. We know this, by the way, because there are Nestorian Christian accounts of debates with the Hagarenes in which they will appeal to no document but the Pentateuch. And for them it was the Abrahamic promise to Ishmael that they would have great descendants that they applied to themselves. They were not interested in those so-called prophets, that is, either the former or the latter prophets, the history books or the writing prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc. And that sure fits, because these guys never make an appearance in the Quran. The Quran speaks all the time of predecessor prophets to Muhammad, but they're always people we think of in a different light. Moses, Enoch, Noah, those are the prophets before Muhammad. Well, yeah, that's because of the Samaritan influence. No accident there. Otherwise, you got a tough time explaining that. Well, as the winds changed, politics and alliances being what they are, the Hagarenes decided it was advantageous to move further away from Judaism. I mean, they had moved from a more orthodox type of Judaism to Samaritanism, but now they turned further to Christianity. And by this time, Umar's messianic significance was forgotten. They tried to re-explain Al-Faruq, the Redeemer, as a gratuitous honorific that over-enthusiastic Christians applied to him, not that he claimed for himself. Or they tried to re-explain it, redefine it in Arabic by a typical etymological story like we find in Genesis, renaming characters, redefining names, and so on. And so they made Umar into somebody else later, we'll see the Caliph, and they said, all right, Jesus was the Messiah. So they decided on that. In fact, the first Arabic king of the liberated Jerusalem made a big show of praying at the sites of Golgotha, Bethlehem, and the empty tomb, implying that they were accepting the whole story of salvation, right? The holy birth, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. Now, Islam eventually decided not to go that far. But you can tell they once did. There's a nativity story. They still venerate Jesus as a sinless virgin-born son of Mary, right? So they kind of kept that. But the crucifixion, they rejected that. It happened to somebody else, remember? Though there is a vestigial reference in the Quran to the death of Jesus. It apparently stems from before they changed this. And boy, they had their hands full trying to make sense of that one. So, all right, there was a cross, but Jesus didn't die on it. So you see, they decided they weren't going to buy the death or resurrection. There's a second coming of Jesus, as we saw, but that's because he's still alive. He was taken up to heaven so that he wouldn't be crucified, and somebody else was. Now you can see here the seedbed for the residual contempt for Jesus we still see among some Arabs today. They look at Jesus as shunning the cross, and there's even a version of the story where he says, which of you disciples would like to gain great merit by dying in my place? Quick now, I got to have a decision fast. And when Muhammad takes a visionary journey to heaven, Jesus is in a lower heaven, not the highest, and he bows down before Muhammad and so on. And there's a kind of a residual contempt toward Jesus that seems to stem from the previous rejection of Jesus, which they had to swallow, but not completely. They still didn't buy the cross. Very interesting selective approach, and you can see how that happened here, if Crone and Cook are right, by the shifting loyalties, deciding we're going to model ourselves after Samaritism, Judaism, no, Samaritanism, no, Christianity, well, not quite, etc. So they eventually changed the story, which everybody does. This Exodus association with the Hejira and them being Hagarenes changes. Now they adopt the other. I mean, it's an easy change to make. They said, yeah, we're Ishmaelites, so Hagar was our mother. Okay, yeah, that's what Hagarenes means. You know, makes sense, an easy change to make. The Hejira, well, they kind of left that out. It was no longer relevant that they wanted to have this exodus to liberate Palestine, which they did. Muhammad was being recast as more important than Umar, whose messianism was now completely irrelevant and forgotten. And so Muhammad becomes a new Moses, which is why he's giving laws in Medina and so forth. And that's why they rewrote the history of it, so that the Islamic conquest of Palestine happened after Muhammad, because remember, Moses had not been allowed to set foot in the promised land to which he had led the people, so Muhammad couldn't have either. So they said, yeah, it wasn't in his day, it was afterward. So the story keeps changing. the notion of Islam, which was that was originally derived from Samaritan characterizations of Abraham as the friend of God, who's at peace with God because he submits to God. It's all connections of the root word for Islam. The Abrahamic background is important because contemporary non-Islamic sources say that Muslims proclaim the commandments of Abraham, namely circumcision and sacrifice. They had brought these two ideas over from prior Arab tradition. They rebuked Jews for rejecting sacrifice and Christian, Jews for not doing sacrifice anymore, which they couldn't, lacking the temple, and Christians for abandoning both. And so they said, oh, you're not living up to Abraham's commandments, hence all these debates and so forth. And let's see. Let me see. I have all sorts of notes. I don't want to burden you with the whole thing here. Well, where does the Quran come from? Well, it doesn't come from Muhammad. It's been slapped together from a variety of early Hagarine texts in order to provide the now Moses-like Muhammad with a Torah of his own. Their prophetology, their doctrine of the prophets and of revelation had developed in such a way that they believed that Moses had brought the Torah, that David had brought the Psalms, because of course the contemporary Jewish and Christian belief was that David had written the Psalms, and even that Jesus had brought the Gospel, the Injil, Evangel, which they apparently thought Jesus himself had written. And so if that's all the case, there must have been a book of revelations from Muhammad, and so one was compiled in retrospect. And the Quran then was supposed to be what Muhammad had been inspired to say. Of course, if you read through the Quran, occasionally you run into references that imply it was already a book in Muhammad's day. This book, this Quran, etc., etc. If it were not from Allah, surely they could have found many contradictions. That doesn't comport with the orthodox idea that Muhammad never had a book as such. It was his own inspired preaching that his followers memorized, and after his death began to write down and compile. Well, something funny's going on there if the writers are already referring to it as this book. So Crone and Cook say that, that's all later. It's been put together artificially as if the revelations to Muhammad. Notice all the anti-Trinitarianism in the Quran. That reflects an attempt to distance Islam from Christianity. Some of the stuff they used, according to Günter Lülling's interesting theory, must have been an Arabic Christian hymnal. In fact, he thinks as much as a third of the Quran is slightly rewritten and really obscured Christian hymnody, and he goes into great detail demonstrating that. Well, yeah, who knows? Anything could have been tossed in there. I'm sure if you've looked into Islam at all, you know how at one point Muhammad supposedly had said that the Qibla, the direction to face during prayer, was supposed to be Jerusalem. But this was at a time when he expected all Jews to agree with him, and they didn't, so he changed it to Mecca. That's interesting enough, and that reflects an early period of identification with Judaism and a later distancing of it. But Mecca wasn't even the first alternative to Jerusalem. There are some early and interesting notes and some archaeological evidence, and namely the way early mosques were built pointing, because of course they're houses of prayer, and they'd be built so that you could be bowing in a certain direction. It appears that before Mecca there was a place called Bakka, B-A-K-K-A, a place actually mentioned in the Quran, which they later said, oh, it's just another name for Mecca, but it apparently was not. In fact, Mecca there's no evidence for Mecca as some sort of thriving center of trade as the standard Islamic story of Muhammad would make it. Remember, that's where all the tribes headed during the month of pilgrimage, and there was a lot of good buck to be made by the rulers of Mecca, and that's why they didn't like Muhammad's preaching. Well, that just gets shot out of the water, because archaeology shows it was no such prominent place. So all sorts of things are changed. Again, Hijra gets redefined. Let's see, you know how when Moses left Egypt, he met up with a family of Jethro in Midian? Well, I have to think that has something to do with Medina, where Muhammad arrives, I should say, after he flees Mecca. In fact, the Islamic story even admits that it was originally called something else, Yathrib. My guess is even that is a reference to Jethro in Hebrew, Yathrib, Yithro. So there's all sorts of Exodus rewriting in the background here. So, what is their historical Muhammad? Some even doubt that. There is one theory. It's about to be published in English by Prometheus, where a scholar argues that Muhammad was originally an epithet of glorification, means the illustrious, when everybody agrees on that. But he says that it was originally a title for Jesus used by Arabic Christians. So there's another piece of evidence that things are not once what they were not always as they are today in Islam. But this, of course, goes much farther than that and says that Muhammad was a fictional creation. I always thought that was rather extreme, but I'm being surprised by a lot of things. Once thought I was about as skeptical as you could get, but it turns out no, not at all. Even I was taken aback. Well, so again, I hope you can find a copy of Hagarism. It's just a great book. Goes on eBay for some $300 or $400, but good hunting. Before the days when everybody was reading up on Islam, I managed to get a copy off the internet for about $20. Lucky me. It's very, there are other views. Joseph Schacht has an interesting view about how they cobbled together Muslim beliefs in Syria. He did a book called The Sectarian Milieu, and it's sort of like these other theories, but an alternative one. We don't really know how Islam started, and what a contrast to earlier, in the 20th century, non-Muslims who studied Islam just imbibed the whole party line and said, oh, this religion was started in the full light of day. Not really. There are some more recent ones that have been, but I'm afraid not that. Let's take another quick look at how a couple of the details I left you a bit unclear on last time about the Shiites. You will recall that they were the first major split-off sect, and then they remain the minority today, though a large and influential one. They dominate in Iran and Iraq, but nowhere else, though they do exist elsewhere, but they don't rule the roost. And I said how this had to do, according to the Orthodox view, with whether Ali should have been the caliph, the caretaker of the movement after the death of Muhammad. And he had to wait his turn. He was a younger man, and older companions of the Prophet, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, took their turns. None of them living very long. They were old men, and finally his turn came, but he was dethroned in a dynastic war, and his two sons, Hussein and Hassan, were brutally butchered in the battles. And the belief grew up that the inspiration of Allah passed down from Muhammad through Ali and his descendants, and each one of them was the imam, the authoritative teacher inspired by God to teach an esoteric interpretation of the Quran and to use hadith, normative traditions about the Prophet, but only those that came from the inner circle of the pillars, the relatives of the Prophet. Now, all these are fictitious anyway, but you see the thrust of this, that the successors of the Prophet should have been his relatives, and that they began to split into different Shiite sects or subsects, because they couldn't agree at certain junctures on who would succeed the previous imam. And let me just tell you a teeny bit about the first Shiite split that resulted in the Zaydis, the Fivers, Z-A-I-D''IS. They championed Zayd, the great grandson of Ali. He was the imam. And I don't know exactly how this happened, but Zayd is the point at which they differ over who the imam should be. But once they split, their succession eventually ended with a man named Muhammad al-Nafs al-Zakiyah. He was a descendant of Ali through Ali's younger son, Hassan. That's already a different branch, because other Shiites trace the line of imams through Ali's elder son, Hussein, who was very much a Christ figure. So it's almost as if they read a historical succession dispute into the past, because they are waiting for Muhammad al-Nafs al-Zakiyah to come back in a triumphal return at the end of the age. They say that he seemed to die, but didn't actually die. It was a docetic, apparent death, and that he's waiting somewhere, apparently on Earth, in seclusion after all these centuries, for a triumphal return at the end. And other Shiites are going to believe this about other descendants of Ali, but these people believe it, and the Zaydis are still alive and well. They're one of the smaller sects. Well, if you go back to the group of Shiites, the main stock of the Shiites from which the Zaydis split, you just go down a couple of more generations to the seventh imam, and here we have the Ismailis or Seveners split off. And as I mentioned last time, the sixth imam was Jafar as-Sadiq, and his son Ismail, his firstborn, was in line to succeed him, but he died while his father was still imam. Well, who should be the second choice? Some in the community argued that Ismail's son should be counted as the seventh imam, as if his father had served. It would mean just skipping a generation, but still continuing the line of the firstborn. And the people who believed that became known as, of course, the Ismailis, the partisans of Ismail or Ishmael. And they are also known as the Seveners, because the succession split as of number 7. But most went with the younger son of Jafar as-Sadiq, that is his second son. And the Ismailis evolved in their own very interesting direction. They eventually gave birth to a lot of Gnostic and Messianic sects of different kinds, including the Druze religion. And they formed the first Shiite state before the rest of the Shiites did. This was the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, in about the 10th century. So they're very important, and they're still around. The Aga Khan is the head of the Ismailis. The famous assassins, or Hashishim, which is what assassin means. They would be drugged into a stupor, and they'd bring in all the virgins and persuade these guys that they had had a foretaste of paradise, and therefore they could go on suicide missions and nothing to worry about, because once they were killed, they would go on up to paradise. Sounds kind of similar to certain things going on today. Okay, but back to the main stock, the people that went with the line of the younger son of Jafar as-Sadiq. What happened with them? Well, they continued on, one imam after another, until their last one, the 12th one, a man named Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Askari, when he must have died as a young man, but it was thought that he had died, but his fans said no, he's just been taken into seclusion, or occultation, right? Occult just means hidden. Allah has taken him away into seclusion, and as the centuries go by, well, he's still there. I could swear I have read that some of them think he's in heaven, but that the major belief is that he's on earth somewhere, and that he will come out of concealment, and at the end, when Jesus appears also to lead prayer in the I think it's the Dome of the Rock, and the Mahdi, the rightly guided one, the hidden imam, will come. He will come out of seclusion. He won't come out of the sky, apparently. He'll just come out of seclusion. And Mahdi, the rightly guided one, that's the title of not just whoever it turns out to be, but of a historic figure whose return they expect, Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Askari. Oh yeah, he's coming back. So, by the way, there have been loads of guys that showed up, both in the Middle East and in Muslim India, over the centuries, claiming to be the Mahdi, just like there have been plenty of people that claim to be the second coming of Christ in Christian territory. I have loads of notes on this, but I guess we'll have to wait for another time. I have taught a comparative messianism course at Unification Seminary. Maybe I'll do that here sometime, but then that's really going to take us off if we do that tonight. I would like to get into some of these sects that grew up on the margins, and first, this is a sort of a movement that cuts across factional lines, but let's do Sufism first. This still exists, of course, and it's technically part of both Sunni and Shia schools of Islam. The Sufism, the Sufis, apparently it comes from the word wool, referring to the simple patched woolen frocks that these mystics wore, and they got the style from the Syrian Christian monks who influenced them in many ways. The Sufis are great fans of Jesus and have well over 100 sayings and stories of Jesus, many of which I have in my pre-Nicene New Testament as a kind of an imaginative substitute for Q. And they may have gotten them from Christian Syrian monks. Well, Sufism started in Islam as an ascetic, eremitical, that is, hermit type reaction to the worldly corruption of the Abbasid Caliphate in Syria in the 2nd century of Islam, that is the 2nd century A.H., Anno Hegirum. This would be the 700s of the Common Era, but 2nd century on their calendar. The Abbasids in Syria also witnessed the greatest sophistication of Islamic literature and sciences and mathematics, but it was also very worldly, and a lot of these guys decided they had to try to get back to the original purity of original Islam by embracing asceticism like the first Muslims of Mecca supposedly had done. This is very much like the retreat of the Christian desert fathers into the desert when Constantine legitimated Christianity, and Christianity got a lot of money and power. Well, a lot of Christian ascetics said to themselves, this cannot be right, and decided they would go out and seek God in the desert. Well, same thing happened here. There are 3 layers of emphasis. You might say you can see this thing growing with tree rings almost. And it's interesting how it developed. The first emphasis of it was simple asceticism. You hated the world, you mortified the flesh, and all from fear of God. This was in the 2nd century A.H. It started this way. Afraid of hellfire, so you will do anything to deny the flesh and choke off any opportunity for sin. And it's all for the fear of God. Hey, I don't want to end up in Gehenna like most people are certainly going to do. Well, in the mid-3rd century A.H., Sufism turned to mysticism. That is, the motivation for asceticism was no longer so much fear of God as it was love and worship of God, and just for his own sake. In fact, Sufis from this period, the 2nd period, explicitly renounce all fear of hell or hope of heaven. No, that poisons the well. It can't be self-seeking. You got to just get into God's own loveliness. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. What, am I doing this to get a ticket to heaven, or is this some sort of insurance policy against going to hell? Oh, God, no. That's self-seeking. That's about me. No, I'm renouncing that. In fact, some Sufis pray and say, if I have any hope of heaven, send me to hell. Let me just be interested in praising you for your own sake. Well, one important, very important premise of mystical Sufism was what's called Fana, F-A-N-A in English, transliteration I should say. This was the eventual extinction of ego or selfhood. It wasn't easy to do, but that's what you aimed at. You wanted to replace it with God, at least experientially. I mean, this didn't necessarily imply some sort of idea, well, what are you saying, you're becoming God? No, they didn't get into that. They're going to later. But this is experiential mysticism at first. All they knew was they were trying to get rid of the experience of the ego and replace it with the experience of God. And what does that mean philosophically? I don't care. It's just this is what I want to experience. Kind of like Buddhism in that sense. They develop an idea of requisite stages on the way to such enlightenment. You start with ascetical, meditational devotions. By that I mean, sleep deprivation, repetition of prayers, and devotion, and starving the body pretty much so you eat enough to stay alive, but you're not enjoying it. But that sounds kind of weird. Well, yeah, of course it does. They knew that. They're going above and beyond the call of mere moral duty. They wanted to get in touch with God and experience God. stage to prepare the seeker for the experience, or what they call the stations, the mystical blessings of grace, including miracles. All of this is unearned. Now, they're necessary. You've got works to do to get to this point. So it's not prevenient grace or anything like that. But it's just you can't deserve it no matter what you do. It's just that your discipline, as Socrates said, is necessary to get your head in the right place to receive what God will give by grace. You are not producing it by your own effort. But once you get your mind on the right thing, get your head on straight, then you are open to the blessings that God in His grace gives, including miraculous healings and so on. Very much like in the Hindu yoga notion of the siddhis, or the achievements, the accomplishments, the perfections. The miracles are not really important, but they're awakened during the progress of toward enlightenment. Well, what is enlightenment? Gnosis. When you read the English translations of Sufi works, you'd think, am I reading the wrong book here? The true Gnostic does this. The true Gnosis is that. Yeah, they're very much Gnostics. You are awakening subtle spiritual senses of imagination, we would translate it. Not just fantasy, but what Jung called active imagination. There is a way in which you can perceive sounds and colors of an unseen world. It's sort of eerie but fascinating the way this is described. You experience soul travel through a spiritual geography that the Sufi masters have outlined, because plenty of them have seen this. Now, are they undergoing certain brain physiological experiences that are going to happen? Yeah, that'd be my guess. But they will tell you what's going to happen, what color of light you're going to see, what mountain you're going to experience seeing, and so on. Just very, very fascinating. They're saying that there is an objective spiritual realm through which you will travel. And then finally, what is this quest for? Well, ultimate union with the light of God. That's kind of cagey. The light of God, not necessarily God Himself, just as Eastern Orthodox Christians speak of theosis as the destiny of the saved, divinization, but they don't want to say you become like an extra person of the Trinity or something like that. They say, no, you're transfigured by the divine energies. This is a very similar sort of distinction. Now, this is getting right to the verge of some sort of metaphysical monism, but the second stage didn't go that far. It's just that you can easily see how somebody's gonna go that far, over the line. And sure enough, in the second half of the 3rd century AH, that's what happens. Sufism passes into its 3rd historical stage of metaphysical doctrine. The earliest of these Sufis are pantheists, or maybe it would be better to call them panentheists. What's the difference? Well, remember, from Hinduism, pantheism is the belief that everything is by nature God, and there is no personal God left over. Everything is God. This is why Spinoza, who was a Jewish pantheist, was also called an atheist, because though he believed everything was God, he didn't believe there was a God to worship. But the Sufis, if you pay close attention to what they say, they do seem to have thought there was a God left to worship, but that you were nonetheless made of God. So they have that kind of both-and view of panentheism. God is in everything. The world is the body of God. God is the soul of the world, and one of the forms God takes is that of a personal deity, and He can be worshipped. So they say God is the only reality. the Sufis say. They say all else, if you promise to put else in quote marks, must be illusion. Now, if you say that, you're a monist. Like there really isn't anything but the one. Or everything is a mode of his manifestation to himself. God is manifesting, but God is the only one, so who's he manifesting himself to? To him. In his fragmentation into the form of many individuals, namely us, we have, in a sense, beings who are by nature God who don't remember it. And so, in a sense, God has entered into a forgetful, fragmented state, and he must awaken to his own godhood. And in a sense, if he didn't, he wouldn't really know it for what it is. To appreciate it, he has to have the perspective of someone who thought they were something else and then woke up to it. Fascinating. In their view, they say Allah first created the man of light, an image of his own attributes, which therefore are his attributes, which in turn really are no different from his essence. I mean, how could one of these things be separated from another? They're all just modes of one another, different ways in which they exist or operate. The divinity is reflected back to itself in enlightened human beings as they open themselves up to their own spiritual inner man or spirit double, who is the primal man of light. And now they say that the first such manifestation of God this way was the Prophet Muhammad. And they actually had a kind of an Aryan logos Christology, where, all right, it's not the uncreated Word of God, but it's a heavenly being, which is the primal man, wisdom, but they are sort of connecting it back up with God in a way that means he was God and so are you. Well, he had appeared in Adam also, and this whole line of thought has deep roots in Judaism, from the Kabbalah, where you're talking about the Adam Kadmon, the heavenly Adam, way back into Gnosticism and so forth. So when they call themselves Gnostics, they're not kidding. Now, did they actually receive this from ancient sources? Did they read old books by Gnostics and pick it up? Or they know Jewish Kabbalah rabbis that told them about it? Who knows? I tend to think they may well just have reinvented the wheel. People just come up with the same stuff again and again. They're in the same world. They got the same brain machinery. They face the same questions, and they come up with the same menu of answers to them. Well, the most famous of these panentheistic or monist or pantheist Sufis was the famous Al-Hallaj, prefix A-L, and then H-A-L-L-A-J. This guy came to a bad end. He went around proclaiming, I am Al-Haq, I am the truth, which everybody understood to be an epithet of Allah, so that he was saying, I am God. And what happened? Well, he got crucified for it. And his brains were bashed in, and oh my God, what a disgusting scene. Was he some kind of nut going around claiming to be God? No, they didn't quite get it. What he meant was, as all Sufis would say, there isn't any I, any ego, any self, but God. If we say we or anything else exist in our own right, we are polytheists. Now that's what? That's an interesting turnabout. Wait a minute now. The chief sin in Islam is shirk, ascribing partners to Allah, polytheism. And they're hearing Al-Hallaj saying he is God, and I said, son of a bitch, he's a polytheist. He's saying he's God. He's a lunatic, but he's also an idolater. He thinks he's God too, like Allah. No, he thought they were the polytheists. He says, you folks naively seem to imagine that even as creatures of God, you really exist as God does. But that can't be, because God is infinite being. What does that leave for you and me? Insofar as we imagine we're different from God, we're just figments of the imagination. And really that is what we are, of God's imagination. But you're the polytheist because you incorrectly think that something that is merely a minor manifestation of God, you are as real as God. Of course, you don't think you're as great as God, but in a way you do, because you're ascribing a kind of an autonomous reality yourself. You're making yourself God. I'm saying I, quote unquote, am the only God there is, Allah, not me, al-Halaj. That's just it's just a soap bubble. And it's like in The Last Temptation of Christ when Jesus has his confrontation with the high priest in the temple. He says, and when I'm saying I'm saying God. And the priest says, that kind of talk can get you in trouble. And sure enough, the same thing happened with Al-Halaj as happened with Jesus. Crucifixion, one cross on the left. So they, of course, they're saying everybody is God, right? It's enlightenment to come to know it. Well, this necessitated a big scrutiny of Sufism by the authorities, and so a bunch of people rose up to, for instance, the great author Al-Ghazali, who wrote The Revival of the Religious Sciences and quoted over 100 sayings of Jesus in it. He kind of ditched the Pantheism, and I would say sort of went back to the previous stage and said, look, we're just talking experience here. There's no way to overcome the difference between us as mere creatures and Allah as our creator, but that's all right. We don't have to claim that in order to experience getting lost in the ocean of God's love. Rumi is more orthodox Sufi. Well, they got into trouble for other things too. They entered a fourth stage, at least some did, of libertinism. Some Sufis indulged in wild behavior and scandalous actions. Why? Well, some religions at this stage of the game will do that because they say, well, now that I know I'm God, the rules that govern mere mortals can't apply to me. So if I really believe in my own divinity, I'll just do whatever the heck I want. But that wasn't quite what they did. Not that this wasn't equally strange. This is almost Kierkegaardian in its strangeness. We have to keep our piety a secret between us and God. We don't want to make a show of it to others. So let's behave in the way that is least likely to blow our cover. Let's really whoop it up. They're never going to suspect that we're truly pious. Now there were others like the great Ibn Said who didn't really live sinfully, but they sure weren't ascetics anymore. They lived in great affluence because naturally people like to support a holy man and have him live in style. It's like in the Gospels, whoever gives a righteous man some support won't lose his reward. He'll have the righteous man's reward. It's paying people to be religious in your stead. It's a trade-off. I support you in being religious. I get the reward as if I were religious. And yeah, so a lot of people were happy to pay the bills. And Ibn Said was known for incredible banquets he opened to the public, and he'd buy the most expensive delicacies in great numbers, and with money that his devotees would give him. Well, suppose somebody said, Ibn Said, you're a Sufi, right? Aren't you guys supposed to be ascetics? Well, he'd say, no, you see, that's only a preliminary stage. Now that God and I are such buddies, well, he wants the best for me. That's mighty convenient, though I'm sure sincere. Now, what was their method of meditation? It was something called dhikr. Hard to say. D-H-I-K-R. It means remembrance or recollection, namely, of the name of God. So you're meditating and repeating Allah all the time. Are you familiar with the Eastern Orthodox Jesus prayer? Because it's the same sort of thing. Just have a different mantra. And this, in time, produces a state of transport. But it's not the only technique. Dancing is big. In fact, this, as you suspected, this is where the famous Whirling Dervishes come into the picture. A dervish is or darvish, take your pick. They're holy men, different orders of holy men. Well, the Whirling Dervishes are the Mevlevi order in Turkey. They spin, and that, I guess it has to do with the blood circulation and so on. That produces a state of ecstasy. Well, all Muslims venerate Jesus, but Sufis especially regard him as their great role model, and so I have all kinds of Sufi sayings of Jesus which depict him as a radical ascetic and one who loves God and also fears him in the sense of not daring to do anything that would put any distance between him and divine contemplation. And what is very fascinating in our age, really in any age though, I guess, is that they had a kind of I guess you could call it an ecumenical emphasis. They understood Sufism to be the core of all religions. They were Muslims, and they were unashamed of that. They didn't think that one need not be a Muslim anymore. One has to go through the door to get to one's destination. One has to follow a path to get there. It may not be the same one that somebody else is following, but you can't just leapfrog it. You've got to go through the stages of conventional religiosity to prepare yourself. And once you get there, you find out that you're going to meet some people there who weren't even Muslims. Christians, Jews, who knows what all. They've all come to the same place through different paths, because Sufism, quote unquote, is the heart and essence of all religions. I suggest to you that if all Muslims were Sufis, we wouldn't be having many of the problems we're having in the world today. A very distinctive kind of Sufism. I might just add one thing. A great Sufi scholar is Sayyid Hossein Nasr, a great authority on all kinds of Islam, but he's a Sufi and a Shiite. His works are not as well known as the guy that does the Nasruddin thing, Idris Shah. He writes all manner of things, or wrote all manner of things about Sufism, but many think he's only nominally a Sufi. He likes and derives much from their tradition, but he's sort of doing his own thing. And that's worth knowing. You're not necessarily getting orthodox Sufism, though he certainly knows a lot. Just one little caveat there, I guess. But there certainly is an awful lot of good material available on Sufism. Well, let's keep going on into the future and the subsequent sectarian evolution. These Ismailis, the Seveners, had begun to develop the doctrine of imams mystically, and from their teaching arose various extremist Ismaili sects, one called the Gulats, which comes over to English as G-H-U-L-A-T-S. And all of these groups believed that Ali, the successor and son-in-law of Muhammad, was Allah in the flesh, and to some degree so was the Prophet Muhammad himself, and a man named Salman al-Farisi, who was one of the companions of the Prophet. How they picked him, I don't know, but they had a kind of a trinity, and so they believed in what was a shocking blasphemy to other Muslims, hulul, or incarnationism. Oh, no, remember, Allah is not the Messiah, etc. But these guys believed it because, of course, they had an esoteric interpretation of the Quran, and you can kind of make anything teach its opposite if you're going to go that route. Well, these Ismaili gulats, or extremists, some of them believed that the imams were also incarnations of Allah. You might say reincarnations in a sense. The incarnation of Allah had been passed down through the line of Ali, through Ismail, and so on. And they believed that there had been a succession of such incarnations, starting with Adam. In each stage of revelation, Allah would come among men as the proclaimer of an exoteric, that is, publicly preached religious doctrine. And so he appeared in the form of, in the personae of Adam, and Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and Muhammad al-Mahdi, the son of Ismail. They believed he was the Mahdi, the rightly guided one. So these had all been God incarnate. And they would preach a new exoteric, that is, exterior level of faith. But God would also send an accompanying hypostasis, not necessarily God as directly as this primary group, but a kind of divine wisdom, a sort of an emanation from the Godhead, and he would be known as the Foundation, or the Silent One. And what do you mean by that? They would preach the foundational truth, the secret inner meaning that gave the real foundation to the outward teaching. Just like Gnosticism always said that what the Catholic Church taught was true as far as it went. It just didn't go very far. It was kid stuff, and they were giving you the real stuff, and it was so deep and different, it seemed to contradict and subvert the outer stuff. Same thing here. Silent One, well, yeah, because this inner metaphysical foundation was only conveyed to certain people, and those who knew it were silent about it and didn't want to get into trouble, as the Sufi al-Hallaj had. A lot of people look back once that happened as a primary example of how maybe you shouldn't be too quick to tell what you really think to certain people, because they're well-meaning, they're zealous for God, but they just don't understand and can't understand, and why should you provoke them into making you into a martyr? If you do, it's going to be your fault, not theirs. Well, anyway, the foundation, or the Silent One, would be sent to provide the esoteric interpretation of the doctrine, and these were Seth, who came to teach the basis of the Adamic revelation, Shem, who came after Noah, Ismail, or Ishmael, who came after Abraham, Aaron, who accompanied Moses, Peter was the foundation for Jesus, Ali for Muhammad, and Abdallah ibn Maimun for Muhammad al-Mahdi. Who is this last guy? Well, he was a dualist heretic who had been influenced by Zoroastrianism and Manichaeanism. So there are two different systems that say that there's a war going on in the cosmos between virtually equal good and evil powers. And so they had some appreciation for this man's teaching. And though he was gone by this time. So that's what the Gulats said. Another extreme group of Ismailis was the Batanis, B-A-T-A-N-I-S. They taught an esoteric interpretation of the Quran, and they claimed that the Fatimid caliphs, who were all descended from Muhammad al-Mahdi, the son of Ismail. Remember I mentioned how it was the Ismaili Shiites who had the first Shiite state, and it was the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt. They believed that all the caliphs descended from Muhammad al-Mahdi were themselves infallible imams and incarnations of the divine reason, the Logos. Reincarnations, by the way, of the Fatimid Mahdi, the guy that they considered the Mahdi who would one day return. Now, these guys were just bringing us to the doorstep of the Druze religion, which is what we're aiming at here. These doctrines of the Gulats and the Batanis had been widely accepted among a lot of Ismailis, including the Fatimid caliphs of Egypt. Of course, the Batani thing only made sense there. It was homegrown. Now, one day, the Ismaili teacher Hamza, H-A-M-Z-A-H, arrived at the revelation that the current Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, H-A-K-I-M, was Allah incarnate, the latest and most perfect in the series of incarnations. So it's not just the divine reason now, but that he was really, God incarnate. He upped the voltage on what the caliphs were supposed to be. And he started to, he recruited some believers, and the first to preach it publicly was one of his disciples, a guy named Ad-Darazi, prefix A-D and then D-A-R-A-Z-I, and now that's where the Druze faith gets its name. Ad-Darazi. He began to preach this publicly in Egypt in the year 1017, and he declared the Caliph Hakim to be God, and then al-Hakim outlawed all other worship. You got to worship me, he said. Now, this didn't go over big with the populace. Most of them weren't even Shiites, much less Ismailis. Most of them were Sunni Muslims, and this was just blasphemy. Hulul, incarnationism. So they couldn't take it, and there was an uprising. Well, as things were getting bad, the Caliph al-Hakim made sure that Ad-Darazi made it safely to Lebanon for refuge. The other teacher, Hamza, had decided that Darazi ought to go there as a missionary anyhow, spread the faith, because he had heard that there was a group likely to believe it, a group of Persians and Persianized Arabs who were familiar with notions a lot like this, and indeed there are Gulat sects all over the Middle East and Central Asia. And he figured, well, they'd go along with this. They're a ripe group for our preaching. So he wanted Darazi to go there, and so the Caliph makes sure he has passage. And Darazi gets there. He goes to Lebanon, starts preaching the doctrine successfully. He starts a group of Druze that survives today. And of course they were the only group that did survive, and they named themselves after him, and that's why we got the Druze religion, D-R-U-Z-E, or in French, D-R-U-S-E, the plural of Darazi. That's where we got ours today. Now, what happened back in the birthplace in Egypt, the birthplace of this faith? Well, Al-Hamza had to go underground with his faith because of popular opposition. He apparently said he was just kidding, or he recanted, or whatever, but outwardly he just said, all right, I'm a conventional Muslim, don't worry. But inwardly, and to his disciples, he still taught the godhood of the Caliph al-Hakim, who was no swell guy. He was an arbitrary tyrant. And so he kind of liked the idea of being proclaimed God. And the Caliph, 3 years later, croaked, apparently. He seems like he was assassinated in a plot engineered by his sister, because I figured they just had to get rid of this guy, because they could not brook having this outrageous heretic as their head of state. And of course, once he disappeared, you know what Al-Hamza taught the faithful about their God king. Oh no, he didn't die. He'd been occulted, taken away into safe refuge, and one day he would return as the Christ and the Mahdi. These things have a habit of happening that way, right? Then he took it on the lam for Lebanon as well, and that was it for the Druze faith in Egypt. But it went on pretty well in its transplanted homeland of Lebanon. Now, once he got there, he found that there was a bit of a problem. It turns out that Druze had preached some kind of libertine doctrine. Now, you see, the Druze faith, of whatever stamp, will tell you that now all of the shadows and the charades and the pantomimes are over, just like the disciples say to Jesus in the Gospel of John at the Last Supper. No more metaphors, no more parables. Now you just speak in the straight truth. Yeah, right. Well, that's what had happened with Al-Hamza and Al-Hakim. And now you're just going to get the straight truth, all of that other stuff, all the previous pillars of Islam, all of it goes on the rubbish heap. Well, you can see how that would lead to disregard of the old moral laws, just like in the Jacob Frank sect of mystical Judaism, right? So that was going on with Druze, but Hamza thought, well, wait just a second. He agreed that all the laws of the Quran had been abrogated, but he didn't think that antinomianism was the proper inference to draw, and that's just like the way the Gnostics we know of reacted to their own, how they lived out their doctrine that they were not subject to biblical law. Most of them seemed to have been ascetics. They denied the flesh. They didn't want to indulge it. I mean, they might have been free to do it, but who would? It's still degrading, even if it's, as First Corinthians says, all things are lawful for me, well, sure, because we have knowledge, but that doesn't mean everything is expedient. You don't have to do everything you can do. There may be practical reasons not to do certain things that you could get away with doing, and so Al-Hamza opposed libertinism. And this split survives even today. We're talking about 1,000 years later. In Lebanon, the Darazites, the Druze proper, are looser in behavior. I don't know what that means. My sources don't say. Looser than the Hamzaites. And the Hamzaites don't even want to be called Druze. They don't want to be named after this religious Hugh Hefner. But in fact, all Druze would really want to be known as Muwahidun, the Unists or Unitarians. They believe in the one God, even though he has been incarnated and so on, that's still the one God, and all symbolism, all ritual is to be wiped away. Well, that's a vacuum that the religious nature abhors, and so in the intervening centuries they have in fact come up with worship services and things like that, but everybody that does that has an excuse for it. The Druze have a complex and fascinating Gnostic doctrine. I mean, it is really like classical Gnosticism in that it traces all the evil in the world back to a fall within the Godhead, that there was Allah, and the first emanation from him became proud of itself and fell, and it's like the fallen Sophia, and also kind of like the Lucifer doctrine. sin entered in through that, and they got all kinds of interesting intricacies about how there was Adam, whose place was taken and usurped by a different primal man figure, Shatneel, which I think must be a slightly garbled version of Sathanael, Satan, the enemy of God. Though I asked a Druze about this once, and he wasn't too sure who Shatneel was. And a religion's in trouble when its own adherents don't really know it anymore. But that's part of modernization. And so they've got this radical Gnostic sort of a cosmology. Sin comes from a fall within the Godhead. That's always a big trademark of Gnosticism. Now, where do they get this? Well, who knows? Because, they could have gotten it from this Ibn Maimun character, who was certainly in touch with older sources. But it's the Druze religion is still going pretty strong over in Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, which is pretty surprising since the Druze neither intermarry nor evangelize. They believe that there was an initial period where one could convert. They call it the period of the call, when the call went out through the preaching of Darazi and Hamza. But when the Caliph, the divine Al-Hakim, disappeared, that period ended. And no one can be asked or invited to convert to the Druze faith. And so you can only intermarry within the Druze community. Now, originally, they were just random converts, and so there's no problem with that. But after 1,000 years, you've got a lot of intermarriage and a narrower gene pool, but they seem to get along okay. And they're a fierce group of fighters. You used to hear about them all the time in the 80s with reports about the war in Lebanon. Walid Jumblat was the head of the Druze community, and he was a warlord. And that was really fascinating stuff. And so it's still going on, as I say, and they believe that all the members are reincarnations of the original members. They don't plan on doing a whole lot of growth anytime soon, but then again, they don't need to. All Gnosticisms are sort of elite movements, as you know. Well, progressing on yet further, I'd like to tell you about the Baha'i faith, which is also alive and well and has become a world religion, albeit a bit sparsely distributed, but it certainly counts. This is another esoteric sort of offshoot of Islam, but this occurred in Persia, or today's Iran, in the 19th century. So this comes well after the Druze religion. It's nearly a whole millennium, and it's a very recent religion. Let me tell you about the two founders of this faith. One of them is, the Baha'is consider him a kind of a founder, maybe a predecessor, a man named Ali Muhammad. He was born in Shiraz in Persia in 1819. He studied and meditated, and he first came to the decision, the revelation, that he was the gate to the hidden Imam, the Bab, B-A-B. What's that? Well, you may remember from a previous lecture, the Bab was an office that was held by whoever was the I guess I'd have to say press secretary of the Imam in any of the Shiite movements, because remember, they were always persecuted, so whoever the Imam was, if they had visual art, his face would be on the post office wall of the Sunnis. They were hunting these guys down, so they had to rule the community, guide the community from seclusion, and they had a go-between wherever they were. The Bab knew it. They're the gate. If you want to get to the hidden imam, if you want to get a message to him, you got to go through the Bab. And if the imam had some word for the community, of course he would let it be known through the Bab. Now you had to just trust that the Bab wasn't some kind of loose cannon or nut who just came up with his own revelations. I would be surprised if that happened. But all these guys were known as the Bab, and they were a kind of a secondary channel of revelation. I'm sure they were targets too, and they had to learn how to be secret agents. Well, eventually, once they believed that the last imam had been occulted for his own safety and was somewhere hidden away, then the character of the Bab became all the more important, because years and centuries would go by, and so you didn't have the imam available anymore, but he could still be given commandments through the Bab. Now, by this time, of course, whoever the Bab was would have to experience dreams or visions or revelations, because he couldn't actually be in contact with the imam, who we would all say was dead. So he became a revealer in his own right, and they believed that when the imam was due to come back as the Mahdi or the Qaim, he who shall arise, another name for the Mahdi, well, the Bab would appear, the Bab, his representative, to prepare the people for his advent. Well, Ali Muhammad decided that he was the gate to the hidden imam, and began preaching that a new dispensation was shortly to begin under the tutelage of the Qaim, he who shall arise, him whom God shall make manifest. And we've got a bunch of the writings of the Bab, who was quite prolific, and his collective writings are known as the revelation of the Bayan. Just like there was the Quran, there's the Bayan, B-A-Y-A-N, and then he came to believe that he was not merely the predecessor, or one might say he was his own predecessor, that he himself was the Mahdi or the Qaim. Now, if that's the case, here he is in obscurity. He had to kind of reinterpret everything figuratively, and he understood his own office as the 12th imam, not in the traditional way as the one who would welcome Jesus back and defeat all evil and destroy the Antichrist and all that. But that's not the important thing anyway, is it? Because the real important thing was that when he came, the Mahdi the Qaim would establish a righteous rule of the true Quranic teaching. And that's the important thing, and he was ready to do that, not by force of arms, but in his teaching he said he was supplanting the Quran and giving the instructions for the new dispensation, which should last some thousands of years at least. And, I guess the difference is he couldn't force and didn't seek to force anybody to live this way. He just figured it would catch on and people would recognize that he was the revealer. And so, that's the important thing, the great age of true divine rule. Okay, through a teacher, not a conqueror. And his role, he thought, was a bit more metaphysical. And here's where he starts to sound like the Ismaili esoteric teachers, though as a 12er Shiite, he certainly wasn't getting much information from them. But he just, again, same sort of a development, albeit on a different branch of the tree. He believed that he was the latest point of manifestation of Allah. Thus, he was the reincarnation of Jesus, Moses, Muhammad, and others. So, what did this mean? Well, it's obviously very much like the Gulat doctrine. And though I don't believe he had in mind the notion that he would be followed by an esoteric interpreter, but this chain of divine manifestations, apparently he really didn't mean divine incarnation, but it's hard to see what the difference would be. Baha'is today will say, yeah, it isn't quite incarnation, but it's pretty close to it. A unique medium of the manifestation of God. Well, he attracted several disciples, the first of whom was Mullah Hussein. He was a disciple of the Shaky sect, and I know you're thinking of all kinds of jokes about that, like the Shakers, but it means the followers of a particular sheikh, right? The Shaky sect, Shayki. This was a group that fervently expected the imminent advent of the Mahdi, and they believed that the chain of imams had been hypostases or aspects of God in the flesh. So they were already really up in the ante on who the imams had been, and therefore who the hidden imam would be. And that he was, kind of like the Logos manifested in the flesh. So they thought the Mahdi is soon to come, and Mullah Hussein went to the house of Ali Muhammad, who I forget how he met him exactly, in the marketplace somewhere, I think, and he offered to explain the Quranic surah of Joseph, which had given Muslim interpreters a lot of trouble. They didn't know what to do with it, because they thought, geez, this is like the story of Joseph in the Bible, which it's based on. It had a love interest, a kind of a soap opera aspect, and they said, geez, how do you square this with being in the scripture? I figured it must have some other allegorical meaning, and bingo. Mullah Hussein asks Ali Muhammad about it, and he gives him an interpretation. I don't happen to know what it was, but this convinced him, and he said that I found it. Here is the Qaim, the Mahdi. And so the Bab declared himself as the Mahdi, and he declared the dawn of the kingdom of God on May 22nd, 1844. I know that sounds kind of silly, but that's only because he dares to be specific. It's not generalities. He's not kidding, right? This is it. I am it. Gotta give him credit for that. Well, things being what they were and still are in Iran today, he was arrested and imprisoned after an initial period of 3 years free preaching. And then and he got a lot of disciples. A lot of people liked this and believed in it. One of the disciples was a man named Hussein Ali, a man actually 2 years his senior. And this man had written a fascinating book called the Kitab-i-Iqan, the Book of Certitude, where he interprets the whole history of Revelation and says that people always, whenever a new manifestation of God appeared in the world, he would always be persecuted because people couldn't understand the truth that the previous manifestation had taught. They took it literally instead of allegorically. They didn't get it. And so they had literalistic expectations of the next one to come, and he wouldn't fulfill them, and they'd think he was a false prophet and persecuted. And he says to his contemporaries, don't you see that's what's happened with the Bab today? He is the Mahdi, but some people don't think so because they have these literalistic, childish expectations. It's a remarkable work, and the Kitab-i-Iqan, available from the Baha'i Publishing Trust. And but back to the Bab himself, there was a huge persecution that started, and the Babis, as they were called, B-A-B'-I-S, followers of the Bab, they weren't going to take it lying down. They armed themselves and fought back, and that led to the execution of the Bab. And there's this great legend about him that the authorities found him praying in his cell when the time came for him to be executed. And they said, come along now. And he said, just give me a minute to finish my devotions. And they wouldn't, and they hustled him out of the cell. And they brought a bunch of soldiers to form a firing squad. But these guys all happened to be Christians, and they refused to do it. And so they said, okay, bring in some Muslims, and they didn't mind shooting them at all. So, bang, bang, bang. But when the smoke cleared, where is he? He had vanished. And they said, well, I don't know what happened here, but let's start looking. And where they find him is back in his cell. And he was finishing up his prayers. He said, okay, now I'm ready. And he went with them and then did get drilled with full of lead there. What a story. Great one. Well, 2 years later, two Babis tried to assassinate the Shah, and that really lit the fires of persecution and nearly extinguished the sect, but they got a shot in the arm because this disciple who had written the Kitab-i-Iqan stepped forth after a revelation that, what do you know, he was the next point of manifestation. Here, centuries before yet another manifestation should start. I mean, look, the dispensation of the Bab had just begun a few years before. Yeah, he would be succeeded by the next in a series of divine manifestations, but just a few years? The early Christians had the problem of the delay of the second coming. This happened too soon, all right? It was a big problem. But what are you going to do? Now, who was this guy that wrote the Kitab of Certitude? Hussein Ali was born 2 years before the Bab on November the 12th, 1817. His father had a dream while the son was yet a child, and in his dream he saw his son, albeit as a grown-up, just swimming or floating around in this great ocean, and his hair and beard were enormously long, and it radiated from his head as his head rested on the water, and looked like the sun's rays. And at the end of each of his tresses, a fish had taken hold of each one, and a remarkable vision. And he woke up and was told that what this meant was his son would be a great leader of all humanity. And I guess, of course, the sunburst image implies revelation. Now, did this stuff really happen? I'm tempted to think not, but it's great stuff from the old myth and legend mill. Continues unabated, and I hope it continues to. He did join the Bab Sect as an adult and became a big theologian for him. And again, as I say, his book is still well worth reading. He never met the Bab, though they did correspond. Now, after this attempt to assassinate the Shah in revenge for the persecution of the Babis, Hussein Ali, who had taken over the name Baha'u'llah, which means the glory of Allah. It's Baha'u'llah, Baha'u'llah. He got in prison for 3 months. Then he was acquitted, and it was during his imprisonment that he received his prophetic call. This was the year 1853. Well, he got exiled to Baghdad for 10 years, and his fame as a sage grew there, and the Muslim authorities didn't like that, so they had him transferred to Constantinople or Istanbul. He went to Adrianople for 4 years, and then to the city of Akka, or Acre, take your pick, in Palestine, where he remained under house arrest until he died. Well, it was in Baghdad, just before the move, that he declared that he was the promised one predicted by the Bab. He was Baha'u'llah. he began to send out epistles to Queen Victoria, Tsar Alexander, Napoleon III, Pope Pius IX, and various other world leaders, asking them to recognize his spiritual sovereignty and to promote God's designs on earth as Baha'u'llah saw them. And perhaps the most famous convert was a Cambridge scholar, Edward Granville Brown, who visited him in Akka and recorded his impressions of him and converted and wrote some interesting stuff. Well, Baha'u'llah died in 1892, so he had a pretty good run there. And he wrote all kinds of stuff, including the book of their laws, the Kitab al-Aqdas, the most holy book, which gives the slate of laws and so on. And it's a remarkable faith. In a way it isn't, because it's in the 19th century when ideas like this were in the air, but sounds pretty good. For instance, he advocated a one-world government, a single world language that everybody would learn to speak on top of their own. You wouldn't have to switch to it, but everybody would have a language they all knew in common. There would be universal currency and trade. There'd be free press. There would be racial and sexual equality. He wanted the reconciliation of science and religion. He wanted to obliterate class distinctions. He wanted universal education, world peace, extermination of disease. Not bad. Some people don't like some of his particular laws, like if you're an arsonist, you ought to be burned to death, and so on. But that might seem a little rough, but on the whole, this is pretty enlightened stuff. Nothing to be ashamed of. Well, what is their theology? Well, they believe that God is beyond all human thought and can only be symbolized. A little tough to reveal something like that, right? You can't really understand it. You only manifest God in human terms. It's kind of a charade, you might say. It's the only thing you can understand. Their view of the afterlife is mysterious, but they say whatever happens to you will be influenced for good or for ill by your present conduct. They don't seem to believe in reincarnation, but they do believe in successive future lives on higher worlds. That is something like the Theosophist belief. So you're not reincarnated in this one, but you don't just go to heaven forever either. There's an eternal progression. That's kind of a favorite liberal Protestant idea in America, too, among some. They don't believe you got to be a Baha'i in order to be saved. They know there are plenty of people that belong to the traditional religions, and of course they claim to be the fulfillment of all the religions. They believe very much in progressive revelation. There's been a long series of revelational dispensations, each one of them founded by a new prophet sent from God, actually a manifestation of God. Each dispensation brings with it a new set of laws, and generally speaking, each one builds on and supplements the one before it. For instance, they'd say that Islam added the collective social, political dimension to the individualism of Christianity. Harnack, Schweitzer, all these guys say that Jesus had no social program, obviously. He's just trying to get individuals right with God before the coming of the end of the world. Well, yeah, but the world doesn't end except for figuratively. Just like Paul Tillich said, Christian eschatology ultimately means there's a particular historical continuity in which Christians live that is defined by the revelation of God in Jesus Christ, but there are other continuities, and it's kind of what they're saying here too. But they'll follow one another, and each message builds on the one before. Now, a later message doesn't have to be more grandiose than the earlier one, or sweep it away completely, but each one does perfectly convey the message. Each manifestation of God does perfectly convey the message that was entrusted to him. And the real thing about progressive revelation, they say, is that each revealer is revealing something better than the form of religion that exists in his own day. Like, it might be that Islam didn't add a whole lot that Christianity didn't have in the way of ethics, but it sure beat what was going on in Arabia at the time. When new manifestations appear in the times of backsliding and literalism and so on, which leads to their persecution, and they've forgotten the original esoteric meaning. And they say, of course, Baha'u'llah brought the greatest revelation, and with it has come the maturity of humanity, which is what Paul says in Galatians. And though that doesn't rule out the future appearance of more manifestations, presumably there will be more. Baha'i, and of course named after Baha'u'llah, the followers of the Baha'is, they claim to fulfill all religions, but that doesn't mean that the other ones ought to be gone. They would say that, very much like Tillich says with Jesus, that he's kind of a plumb line or a yardstick by which they evaluate the traditions of other faiths, but that doesn't mean they think they're wrong. I mean, if you're doing well as a Muslim or a Christian or whatever, that's fine. They don't tell you gotta leave it. So there's a kind of a cultural pluralism or relativism. They don't like the traditional view of Jesus as an incarnation of God, but they do think he's a point of manifestation, which is, there's some difference, of course, but it's not like they demote Jesus to the status of a prophet or something. And they're not big on Paul. I guess, like many people in the 19th century, they blamed Paul for deifying Jesus. Of course, it's a much more ambiguous picture than that. Now, despite Iranian persecution, the Baha'i faith certainly does exist all over the world today. Again, sparsely, but it's there. They've had a heck of a time in their native land, though, just like they always did. Khomeini had his barbarians bulldoze one of their most sacred shrines, and what a mess. But they're going strong, especially in the United States. And this is the only religion in this trajectory, I guess you could say, where they actually have a picture of the Savior, an actual photograph, but they don't publish it. You would have to go to Israel to see it in a shrine they have there. And most of them don't, but you can see it. Boy, I'd love to see that. But again, he's not an ancient figure, so it's not that surprising. Now, what happened with the Babi faith? Did everybody jump on the Baha'i bandwagon? Well, no, they didn't. Eventually, most of them who were still alive did. But the Bab, before he died, didn't appoint Hussein Ali, Baha'u'llah, as his successor. He didn't know anything about that. Of course, neither did Baha'u'llah at the time. So he appointed his brother, Subi Azal, to be his caliph, so to speak, the caretaker. And once the next, it couldn't be any more than that, because the next point of manifestation wasn't to arrive for many centuries. So what happened when Baha'u'llah stepped forward and said, look, I'm here already, I don't understand it any more than you do, but I can't go against the will of God, here I am. Subi Azal couldn't quite buy that, and a lot of followers said, this guy's just an opportunist. So there were some that stuck with Subi Azal and are just unreconstructed Babis, but nowadays they tend to be called Azalis, since it's a succession thing. They went with a branch that went with Subi Azal rather than Baha'u'llah. And now, who ran the show after the death of Baha'u'llah? Well, his son Abdul Baha took over, and his writings are considered to be inspired scripture on the level with that of Baha'u'llah. And then after Abdul-Baha died, I think it was his son Shoghi Effendi took over, and again his writings are considered canonical. I'm not quite sure. I don't think there's anyone of similar authority today, but the voluminous writings of these guys were pretty much enough, I guess. Everything's pretty clear there. I don't know if there have been people coming forward to claim to be the next point of manifestation. I'd love to know that. I hung around with some Baha'is for a while and really got to know them and like their religion. Never converted, though. I'd love to know, though, if someone has come forward. I just bet they must have. And it's quite interesting. I've met various people that converted from Islam to this and who were glad to get the heck out of Islam, though technically they shouldn't be hostile to it. You can see how Islam is hostile to them, because they say they're a future revelation and all that supersedes Muhammad and the Quran, but there should be a kind of generosity, one would think, there are various musicians that are Baha'is. I first heard of the Baha'i faith from Seals and Crofts on the Mike Douglas show in the late 60s, and was fascinated by it. And there's Seals and Crofts' song, The Garden of Cloves or something, which is really moving and has to do with meeting Baha'u'llah and so on. So, fascinating faith, and one author that had some connection with this was Khalil Gibran. Though he was a little mixed up, he once attended a public appearance by Abdul-Baha, jumped up on stage and said, "I attest that Abdul-Baha is the manifestation of God." Well, no, he isn't. They don't really think that of him, and then he ran out, and so some sort of Baha'i connection. And I recommend Gibran's great book on Jesus, the Son of Man. It radiates the same kind of interesting esoteric spirituality. Great stuff. There are more of these groups, and I guess I would like to very briefly tell you about one more because of its interesting connections with early Christian matters and so on. This is the Ahmadiyya Sect. I won't take too long on this, but it's just too good to miss. This was also a 19th and barely 20th century figure, a man named Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. He was born in 1838 and died in 1908. He was born to a Sufi family in the Punjab, over in India. In 1879, he claimed to have a divine revelation, and he was called. It was his duty to proclaim it to all nations. Well, what was it? The very next year, 1880, he published his book, the Burhan-e Ahmadiyya, in which he announced that he himself was both the Christian Messiah and the Islamic Mahdi. And 9 years later, 1889, he formally founded the Ahmadiyya Sect, Ahmadiyya. It's named after him, obviously, Ahmad. At first, he seems to have understood himself primarily as the Christian Messiah and spent the bulk of his apologetics efforts to demonstrate that he wasn't exactly Jesus himself, but possessed the spirit and power of the Christ, and as such, he was the fulfillment of the prophecy of the Second Advent. Now, that's almost exactly the same thing Reverend Moon teaches in the Unification Church, that he's the Lord of the Second Advent. He's the fulfillment of the prophecy of the second coming of Christ, but the prophecy was figurative. And he said, well, look, what about Jesus and John the Baptist? When they said, well, hey, isn't the prophet Elijah supposed to appear before the Messiah? Well, he did, but not literally. John the Baptist was, quote, Elijah, unquote. What's the matter? That's not good enough for you? Well, Reverend Moon, just like Ahmad here, said that that was the deal. It wasn't Jesus himself personally returning. But this was the fulfillment of that prophecy. He was the fulfillment. And for Ahmad, there couldn't be a literal second coming of Jesus anyway, because he didn't wind up in heaven. And this is a really interesting variation on Islamic belief. Remember, traditional Muslims believe that Jesus didn't get crucified. Somebody else, many theories as to who was crucified in his stead. Jesus was taken up to heaven instead. He was not on that cross at all. But this man, Ahmad, had imbibed the spirit of, I think, of the 18th century rationalists, and argues in exactly the same way they did, that Jesus was crucified, but survived it. He didn't die and rise. He cheated death, but he was crucified. He, however, was brought down from the cross alive, and he could explain how the machinations of his sympathizers and conspiracy managed to get him off of the cross before he could die, and so on. So he thought the Christian doctrine of a death of Jesus and his resurrection was just awful. It was just a big mistake. But he was a big Jesus fan. But okay, what happened after that? Jesus survived crucifixion, and he left Palestine, and he went to teach eventually in India, and finally in Kashmir, where he died. Now, there was a traditional tomb of some saint known as Yusuf Asaf, a couple of good Bible names, and Ahmad identified his tomb as that of Jesus. Oh yeah, he's the one that's in there. And there's still people that write books trying to defend that today. And so where does that put Jesus? Well, he's dead. He's not waiting in heaven for the second coming, having avoided crucifixion. He's not resurrected and waiting at the right hand of God for the second coming. He's just dead. And so there can't be a literal second coming, because he did survive the cross, but died years later in Central Asia. Interesting. So this is kind of like Islam, but it's heresy in the eyes of Muslims, because they don't believe he was even crucified, and they sure don't believe he died at any point. Okay. Now, unlike most people that have claimed the office of the Mahdi, Ahmad made no attempts to gain political power. I think he was wealthy, but he wasn't powerful politically and didn't try to take over anything. So he claimed to be the second coming of Christ. He claimed to be the Mahdi, and in later life he also decided that he was Kalki, the eschatological avatar of Vishnu. You know, he would appear on the white horse and bring an end to the world as we know it and all that. But his followers found that so distasteful that they just decided they'd kind of ignore that, because they were used to considering Hinduism as just a false, idolatrous religion. The idea of him embracing that too, they said, nah, let's just forget he said that. But it went on pretty powerfully, and it was an aggressive missionary religion that published a lot of books, and the Ahmadiyya Sect is still a worldwide missionary movement. Now, I'd like to know how many of them there are compared to Baha'is and so on. Don't happen to know that. I'm sure it's not too tough to find out. But the Ahmadiyya is still around. Now, there are plenty of other Mahdis that showed up. And maybe the next most famous one is a guy named Muhammad Ahmad ibn Abdallah, who was the famous Sudanese Mahdi, who is the villain in the Charlton Heston film Khartoum. It was also 19th century, and there were loads of other ones, but I mention these because here with the Druze, the Baha'is, and the Ahmadiyya, we have living sects that spun off from Islam in the same way Islam had developed out of Christianity, Christianity out of Judaism, and so on. And there probably are more, but these are the ones I know of. Two of them as late as the 19th century. And they're not very popular, as I say, among Sunni or most Shiite Muslims, who consider them just abominable heretics. So it continues on, and there are other evolutions from within Christianity that short-circuit Islam and its whole list of offspring, like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Unification Church. They're both evolving towards separate religious identities. And I suppose I probably ought to do a session on them, but we probably have too many in this course already, so I think I will call it quits with that, and thank you for accompanying me through this journey through the world religions. If one day I tack on a PS, it'll be about the Mormons and the Moonies, but until then, I'll see you on the funny pages, or the scripture pages, if you can tell the difference.